A Connecticut teenager is dead, and her now 19-year-old boyfriend has been charged in connection with her death more than a year after she died. Criminal defense attorney Anthony Osso joins us to dive deeper into this strange case as the details of what allegedly happened begin to unfold. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so I'm going to lay out a story for you, and I want you to follow along. It's not the easiest to understand, but I will tell you, it is harrowing nonetheless. Now, we're talking about 19-year-old Cooper Ouellette. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name, Ouellette. From Harwinton, Connecticut, he has been charged with manslaughter after a year-plus long investigation into the death of his girlfriend, 17-year-old Sophie Ringquist. Now, we want to take a step back and go to last May 2023 when this whole thing happened. So according to the arrest warrant, Ouellette and Sophie went to a party on May 20th. Ouellette picked Sophie up, drove the two to a friend's house, but while on the way there, police say they stopped at a store and bought alcohol. By the way, at the time, Ouellette was just 18 years old. Now, the arrest warrant says that around 8:30, the couple arrived at the party, and over the course of the night, there were several witnesses who reported that they saw Sophie and Ouellette arguing, even some seeing physical violence between the two. Witnesses say they allegedly saw Ouellette shove his girlfriend against the side of his truck and kick her with his heavy work boots, knocking her to the ground. Afterwards, Sophie reportedly tried to find an alternative ride to go home, but that didn't happen. And then, just after 11 that night, Sophie reportedly called someone. Could have been a friend or a relative. It's unclear since the arrest warrant has redacted several names, but the arrest warrant does state that she said Ouellette was really drunk, following her around, and then the call abruptly ended. Short time later, Ouellette's phone began recording that he was moving, traveling away from the party, and police believe he was driving away and that Sophie was reportedly seated in the front passenger seat. And they began driving towards Burlington, Connecticut, towards Sophie's home, and along the way, the investigation reveals that Ouellette was allegedly driving between 39 miles per hour and nearly 74 miles per hour along a 45 mile per hour speed limit road. As the couple headed towards Sophie's home, about 20 minutes away from the party, the warrant says Sophie began recording a selfie video in the truck, which depicted the car slowing to a stop. Now, all of this, obviously a little questionable, drinking and driving, a couple of incidents of reported violence between the two, but this is where things take a turn. Because according to the warrant, as Sophie was getting out of the vehicle, Ouellette allegedly suddenly stomped on the gas pedal, and a hard acceleration of a diesel engine was reportedly heard on the cell phone video, as well as an audible thud and a voice in the background yelling, "Ow." Ouellette's Chevrolet truck is allegedly seen on the video driving away, and Sophie is reportedly heard gasping for air and sobbing as this video ends. That is when an eerie text message was reportedly sent to the person that Sophie had called earlier in the night saying, quote, "I'm scared." She also reportedly sent 2 selfies on Snapchat to someone depicting a bloody nose. Now, according to the arrest warrant, Sophie apparently gets back in the truck, and based on both of their cell phone location data, they continue on their way towards her home. And the two ride around for a bit, the warrant says. Ouellette was driving in an erratic manner, rapidly accelerating his truck, abruptly slowing down, revving up his truck's diesel engine and squealing the truck's tires as he drove in a circle around Sophie's neighborhood. The truck apparently bypasses Sophie's home, turns around, heads the opposite direction before bypassing her driveway a second time. Now, that is when Sophie allegedly gets hit, but there's different theories on how that exactly happened. Ouellette allegedly tells police that Sophie said she had to vomit, she was sick, she jumped out of the truck before he could stop, and subsequently he hit her or ran her over, apparently told police that he was only going 10 miles per hour. There are other versions where he allegedly says she jumped out and he didn't stop, or she jumped out head first. But investigators say sometime during this drive around, Sophie fell out of the truck, and that is when Ouellette ran her over and she was crushed by one of the truck's tires. Ouellette allegedly dragged her body with the truck and stayed at the scene of the incident for about 8 minutes before driving back to Sophie's home. And a short time later, the truck is reportedly seen on home surveillance footage, and it appeared no one was in the passenger seat. Then Ouellette is seen on video stopping the truck in a driveway and allegedly repositioning Sophie's seemingly lifeless body in the front seat. This is, again, according to the arrest warrant. Ouellette runs inside the home. Her family then rushed her to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead an hour later. The medical examiner would determine that she died of blunt impact injuries and declare this a homicide. Key piece of evidence to note: the affidavit says that Sophie had a history of sharing pictures with her friends of injuries she allegedly sustained at the hands of Ouellette. And this all brings us back to a year and 2 months later, where Ouellette turns himself in after a warrant was issued, and he's charged with first-degree manslaughter and providing alcohol to minors for bringing the alcohol to the party. He's been released on a $50,000 bond. Now, Sophie's family released a statement to local media saying, quote, "As Sophie's family, we would like to thank the state police and all other entities that worked tirelessly over the past 14 months to find out what happened to her and brought charges against the person responsible for her death. We implore anyone who has been a victim of or witness to domestic violence to stand up for the victim and report it to the police. We would like to thank all friends, family, and people Sophie had an impact on for their continued prayers as we negotiate this part of the process in our continued search for truth and justice for Sophie." Now, even though these are just allegations in this case, very serious allegations, if you are experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. All the calls are toll-free. They're confidential. Hotline available 24/7, and it's also available in more than 170 languages. Okay. Well, joining me right now to help dive into this is criminal defense attorney Anthony Osso. Anthony, thank you so much for coming back here. A lot to unpack with this story. What is their background as a couple? Even just what witnesses allegedly saw that night. What does that say about the case?
Well, I think that in those kinds of cases, you look at nature of the relationship evidence, right? If there are prior instances of violent conduct by by Ouellette towards Sophie, that's something you're going to look at to show the intention of what he was doing that night.
And are you surprised that something like this takes so long for there to be an arrest? What was it, 14 months, this investigation? Are you surprised that it took that long?
I am surprised it took that long, especially when you have a homicide at play. But there's a lot of factors going on here. This isn't your standard one person shoots another person with a gun. You've got a lot of witness accounts. You've got automobile type evidence, and you've got to look at the autopsy and see, is this an intentional or is this a reckless act? So I'm not surprised it took as long as it. I'm not surprised it took long, but it took a little longer than I thought it would.
And you mentioned reckless, and you mentioned what kind of act is this? So it's a homicide. Homicide can mean a lot of different things. Here they've charged him with first-degree manslaughter. And you and I were talking before we got on about it's an interesting charge to hit him with, and I want to talk about that. So my understanding, under Connecticut law, this is what manslaughter is: that a person is guilty of manslaughter in the first degree when, one, with intent to cause serious physical injury to another person, he causes the death of such person or of a third person, or two, with intent to cause the death of another person, he causes the death of such person or of a third person under circumstances which do not constitute murder because he committed the prescribed act or acts under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance, or three, this is the final one, under circumstances evincing an extreme indifference to human life, he recklessly engages in conduct which creates a grave risk of death to another person and thereby causes the death of another person. So, Anthony, now that I've listed up, do any of those make sense under the facts laid out in this case?
I think so. I think the indifference to human life is the applicable statute or law you go with here. He's driving recklessly. She gets out of the car. Whether he intends to kill her, that might be a hard case to make as a prosecutor. And so when you're making that charging decision, manslaughter is sort of a good fit where you can say, well, if he knew she was getting out and I speed off in a car, that could likely cause her to be hurt or killed. And so that's an indifference to human life.
And I believe this carries up to 20 years in prison. But
Yes.
I guess his defense would be she jumped out, right? And how would the prosecutors be able to prove that didn't happen?
Right. I think it's a difficult case from that perspective. You also have causation issues because Sophie didn't die immediately. And so you're going to want to request the medical records to make sure that it was, in fact, the blunt force trauma that caused her death. But the case poses issues. I think what the prosecutors are going to really have to lean into is the nature of that relationship. Prior instances of violent conduct, Sophie saying, I'm afraid, Sophie saying or sending pictures of injuries of a bloody nose that occurred that night. Those are going to be really important facts that the prosecution would need to lean into to get over that hurdle.
Hey, let me just take a minute to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's Law and Crime YouTube takeover, America's largest personal injury law firm. Look, if you're in that position where you're hurt and you need legal representation, this may be the firm you want in your corner. Specialists in this area. A firm that has secured verdicts and settlements in the multi-millions across this country. A firm that doesn't settle for lowball offers. A firm where there's no upfront fee. You only pay them if you win. A firm that makes the whole process so easy for their clients, because from starting your claim to uploading documents to talking to your legal team, it can all be done from your smartphone. So if you've been injured, you can easily start a claim by going to forthepeople.com/YouTube takeover. I laid out the facts, the timeline of it. It gets a little confusing, right, in terms of allegedly speeding up the car, her getting hit, her getting back in the car, something happens. The part that I guess I'm a little confused about as well is there seems to be this part where she gets back in the car, but we do not know the moment of when she's killed, right? That's not captured on surveillance, doesn't appear captured on a Snapchat. How much does everything else that is captured before, like I mentioned, the text message, the Snapchat photos, the selfie, how much does that factor into what ultimately led up to her death?
Well, I think it's hugely important. I think if you have evidence that they were fighting that night, if you have evidence where Sophie is getting out of the vehicle and Ouellette is aware that she's trying to get out of the vehicle, and he's drinking that night. These are all things that kind of lead into an awareness that she doesn't want to be in that car. And so when that door opens, you've got to stop the vehicle. And that's what I think they have to lean into. Now, from a defense perspective, like you said, she's contributing to the issue and she's jumping out of the car.
I wonder if, but the fact that she was documenting it, right? You know, she was documenting she had an injury on her nose, bloody nose, talking about I'm scared. Now, could that work both ways? I mean, in the sense like he could say look, there's easy perspective for the prosecution, right? He wouldn't let her out of her sight. He wouldn't let her take a ride with somebody else. He was driving erratically. She was trapped. She was scared. She had no choice but to jump back in the car with him because what is she going to walk home? That's, I think, a good argument for the prosecution, right? And he took advantage of that. The other way for the defense could be, well, if she's able to document this and it shows that she was either A, acting erratically herself, or B, she could have taken the opportunity to call someone for help or do something. You know, she was in her own position where it wasn't as dangerous as the prosecution's believing or alleging, right? I guess that's two ways to look at it. I seem to believe the evidence is stronger, though, for the prosecution's narrative than this alternative defense narrative I just came up with.
I tend to agree with you, Jesse. I think that any argument that she should have, could have, or would have called the police. It sounds like the witnesses are saying it's just a really hard hurdle to overcome if there's documented witness accounts of him being physically violent,
right,
and there are documented injuries to her. I mean, I think that sending a text is probably easier than getting on the phone and calling somebody. And I imagine that when she was in the vehicle that night that she was scared. But if I'm the defense attorney, I'm leaning into her jumping out of the car. Just like you stated earlier, I think that is probably your best angle, in that it wasn't a willful disregard. She intentionally put herself in a dangerous situation.
How tough is it if it's a battle of the experts to determine what caused her death, right? So they have blunt impact injuries is the one that is being declared by the medical examiner, but you would have a defense expert, I would imagine, saying, no, it's possible that this was caused by her jumping out of the car and her being run over accidentally, not that he deliberately did it or pushed her. I guess that's the question, is how much can the injuries determine this, whether this was an accident or whether this was manslaughter?
I think when it comes to the cause of death evidence in homicide cases, both defense and the state are typically going to rely on the medical examiner in the county. And so you don't oftentimes see a battle of the experts when it comes to the cause of death. These are qualified experts. They've reviewed thousands of bodies in their careers, and typically they've got jurisdiction over the body. So I haven't seen a lot of that where you're arguing about cause of death. Now, I think good cross-examination points to be made are going to come from the defense attorney calling into question, well, was it the tire that caused the injury, or was it her jumping out of the car and hitting her head that caused the injury? But I don't know that an expert will be reviewing the body.
And the fact that he turned himself in, spoke with law enforcement about this, does that signify to you, A, look, he doesn't want to be a guy on the loose, he doesn't want to run for police, he doesn't want to get in more trouble, or does it signify to you he may want to work out a plea deal? I mentioned some bad evidence in this case. Do you think a plea deal would be on the table for someone? Does his age factor in? How young he was at the time. He's 19 years old now. He was 18 years old then. Does that factor into it as well? So overall, how likely is this to actually go to a trial?
It could be a number of things. So I can't say how likely it is to go to a trial if I haven't sat and reviewed the evidence and heard what the prosecution's offer is. If I've got a client, I'm probably not advising him to speak with the police. But on the rare occasion that can work in someone's favor. And it could be, again, that he doesn't want to be on the lam running. That's a tough game to play. So it's still up in the air at this point.
Well, for her family, they've been waiting a while, 14 months for this investigation to come to a point right now, a conclusion point. I don't even want to say conclusion because we still would have the legal case to go through. But it's a really, really sad case. And as I went through the timeline of it, really harrowing. But Anthony Osso, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate your perspective as always.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
All right, everybody, really sad case there, but thank you so much for joining us here on Sidebar as we break it down. As always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.